His secrets were her undoing. Bianca Vitali had always known her father played dangerous games, but she never thought she would be the one to pay. When his empire collapsed, there was only one man left standing, Matteo Greco. He smirked, tilting his glass. "Your father lost everything," he murmured. "Now let's see what you're worth." Chapter 1. The Shadow of a Fallen Empire. The scent of lilies and old money usually comforted Bianca. Tonight, it felt like a shroud. The Grand Vitali mansion, once a beacon of power and opulence, now echoed with the silence of a fallen dynasty. Her father, Don Lorenzo Vitali, was gone. Not dead, but worse, in her opinion stripped bare, exiled, a ghost of the formidable man he once was. All because of a wager, a foolish, arrogant gamble with a man known only as Il Diavolo, the devil.
Matteo Greco.
Bianca ran a trembling hand over the smooth, cool surface of the mahogany dining table. It was long enough to seat 30, but tonight, only she sat there, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock her solitude. The crystal chandelier above, usually a dazzling spectacle, seemed dimmed, reflecting the muted despair that had settled over her like a heavy cloak. She'd always known her father lived in a world of shadows, a world of whispered deals and unspoken threats. The mafia was a part of her life, woven into the very fabric of her existence, as familiar as the rosary beads her nana had taught her to pray with. But she'd always been shielded, kept at a distance from the brutal realities. Her father had insisted on it, building a wall of normalcy around her private schools, art lessons, summers in Tuscany, far from the gritty streets of their ancestral home in Palermo. Now that wall had crumbled. A sharp rap at the front door startled her. It was late, far past the hour when respectable people called. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her. She rose, her silk dressing gown rustling softly around her, and moved towards the grand foyer. Through the frosted glass panel of the door, she could see the silhouette of a man, tall and imposing. He wasn't one of her father's men. She knew them all. Hesitantly, she opened the door, a sliver at first, the heavy chain still latched. "Signorina Vitali?" His voice was deep, a resonant rumble that sent a shiver down her spine, despite its politeness. He held a fedora in his hand, revealing dark, slicked-back hair and a face that was both strikingly handsome and undeniably dangerous. Sharp, intelligent eyes, the color of dark roast coffee, assessed her with an unnerving intensity. "Who are you?" Her voice was steadier than she felt.
Matteo Greco.
The name hit her like a physical blow.
Il Diavolo.
He was younger than she'd imagined, perhaps in his late 30s, but the aura of power he exuded was palpable. He wasn't overtly threatening, yet every instinct screamed at her to slam the door and run. But where would she run? Her father had lost everything, this house, their businesses, their security, all of it, to this man. He tilted his head, a slight, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. It wasn't a smile of amusement, but something colder, something that spoke of ownership. "May I come in, Signorina? We have much to discuss." It wasn't a request.
It was a statement.
A declaration of the new order. Bianca knew, with a sickening certainty, that her life had irrevocably changed. The carefully constructed world she'd inhabited was gone, replaced by the shadowy, unpredictable reality of her father's downfall. And this man, Matteo Greco, was the architect of her new, uncertain future. She unlatched the chain, her hand trembling slightly.
"Come in, Signore Greco."
He stepped inside, his presence filling the vast foyer. The scent of his cologne, something dark and spicy, mingled with the lingering fragrance of lilies, creating a strange, unsettling juxtaposition. He followed her into the dining room, his eyes taking in the grandeur, the remnants of a life that was no longer hers. "Your father left in a hurry," he said, his voice smooth as velvet, yet edged with steel. "He was advised to leave," Bianca replied, choosing her words carefully. She wouldn't give this man the satisfaction of seeing her fear, her vulnerability. She would meet his gaze, hold her head high, even as her insides churned with a mixture of terror and a strange, unfamiliar defiance. Advised? He raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement flickering in his dark eyes. By whom, I wonder? She didn't answer. She knew who had advised her father. It was the same consortium of families, the Commission, that had once bowed to Lorenzo Vitali. Now, they had turned on him, orchestrated his downfall, and handed his spoils to Matteo Greco. Matteo moved closer, his gaze sweeping over her, lingering on her face, her throat, the delicate curve of her wrist where a pulse fluttered betrayingly. Bianca fought the urge to shrink back, to cover herself. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a specimen under a microscope. Your father made a wager, he said, his voice dropping to a low murmur. A very foolish wager. Bianca already knew the details. Her father had been confident, arrogant, believing he could outmaneuver Greco in a high-stakes poker game, a game where the stakes were far more than money. It was about territory, influence, power. Lorenzo had believed he held the winning hand. He'd been wrong. He lost, Bianca stated, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. He lost everything, Matteo corrected, his gaze unwavering. Including you. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Bianca stared at him, her heart pounding against her ribs. What do you mean? She asked, though she already knew, the dread coiling tighter in her stomach. He stepped even closer, invading her personal space, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. The candlelight flickered, casting shadows that danced across his face, making him look even more like the devil he was reputed to be. Your father, in his desperation, offered you as collateral, he said, his voice a low, seductive whisper. A prize for the victor. Bianca felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Her father, the man who had always protected her, had used her as a bargaining chip. A pawn in his dangerous game. The betrayal cut deeper than any fear she felt for her own safety. I don't believe you, she whispered, the words sounding weak even to her own ears. Matteo reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a touch that was both possessive and strangely gentle. Bianca flinched, but she didn't pull away. She was frozen, caught between fear and a strange, unsettling fascination. Believe it, Cara, he murmured, his voice a silken caress. Your father lost everything. Now, he tilted his glass that a silent servant materialized to fill, his gaze locking with hers. Let's see what you're worth. The words were not merely about money and power, they were a direct challenge, an assessment of her spirit, her strength. And in that moment, Bianca knew this was just the beginning of a very different, very dangerous game. One she had no choice but to play. Chapter 2. A debt unpaid, a life transformed. The silence that followed Matteo's pronouncement was thick with unspoken implications. Bianca stood frozen, the delicate china cup in her hand threatening to slip from her numb fingers. The remnants of the hastily prepared meal, a simple pasta dish she'd made for herself, a futile attempt at normalcy, sat untouched on the table. The scent of basil and garlic, usually so comforting, now seemed to mock her with its reminder of a life that was gone. You expect me to do what? Bianca finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. She refused to believe her father would truly offer her up like some prize. But the look in Matteo's eyes, the cold certainty in his voice, left little room for doubt. Matteo took a slow sip of the deep red wine, his gaze never leaving hers. He savored the moment, the power he held over her, like a connoisseur appreciating a fine vintage. To honor the debt, he said, his voice smooth as silk. Your father's debt. But I am not a debt, Bianca protested, a spark of defiance flickering within her. I am a person. He smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a shiver down her spine. Indeed. And a very beautiful one. Your father spoke highly of your accomplishments, your education, your refinement. He considered you his most prized possession. The words were meant to wound, to strip her of her dignity, and they succeeded. Bianca felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She hated the way he looked at her, the way he spoke of her, as if she were an object to be evaluated, appraised, and ultimately possessed. "I am not his possession," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but her gaze unwavering. "And I am not yours." Matteo chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that echoed in the vast dining room. "Technically, Kara, you are. Until the debt is paid." "And how is that to be paid?" Bianca asked, the question tasting like ash in her mouth. She knew, on some level, what he meant. Marriage. She would be forced to marry this man, this devil, to save her father, to salvage what little remained of their family's honor. He set down his glass, the delicate clink echoing in the silence. He moved closer, his presence overwhelming, his scent that dark, spicy cologne filling her senses. "By becoming my wife," he said, his voice a low murmur, his eyes locking with hers. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating.
Wife.
Bianca felt a wave of panic rise within her. She had always dreamed of marriage, of course, but not like this. Not to a man she feared, a man who represented everything she had been taught to despise. She had envisioned a love match, a gentle courtship, a shared future built on mutual respect and affection. This was a business transaction, a cold, calculated arrangement. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He shrugged, a gesture that was both casual and dismissive. "Your father will remain in exile. His enemies will find him, and you will be left with nothing. No protection, no resources. You will be at the mercy of those who would gladly see the Vitali name extinguished forever." The threat was clear, and it was effective. Bianca knew he wasn't exaggerating. The Mafia was a ruthless world, and her father had made many enemies. Without Matteo's protection, however begrudgingly offered, she would be vulnerable, exposed. She looked away, her gaze falling on the flickering candlelight, the shadows dancing on the walls. She was trapped. There was no escape. She had to choose between her own freedom and her father's safety, between her own happiness and the remnants of her family's legacy. I need time," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Matteo studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he nodded, a curt, almost imperceptible gesture. "You have 24 hours, he said. "I will return tomorrow night for your answer." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway, looking back at her. "Don't try to run, Kara," he said, his voice soft, but laced with steel. "I will find you, and the consequences will be unpleasant." He left, the heavy front door closing with a resounding click that echoed in the silence. Bianca stood there, alone in the vast, empty mansion, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a physical burden. 24 hours. It wasn't enough time to mourn the life she had lost, let alone decide her future. She sank into a chair, her legs no longer able to support her. The tears she had been holding back finally came, hot and bitter, streaming down her face. She wept for her father, for herself, for the shattered remnants of her dreams. As the night wore on, and the candles burned low, a flicker of resolve began to ignite within her. She was a Vitali. She had been raised to be strong, resilient. She wouldn't crumble. She wouldn't let Matteo Greco break her. She would find a way to survive, to navigate this treacherous new world, to protect herself and, if possible, her father. She wiped away her tears, her chin lifting with a newfound determination. She had 24 hours, and she would use every second of it to formulate a plan. She might be forced to marry the devil, but she wouldn't become his victim. She would be his equal, his adversary. And perhaps, one day, she would even be his downfall. The thought, however improbable, brought a flicker of a smile to her lips. A smile that was both defiant and dangerous. It was a smile, though she did not fully realize it, that held a glimmer of her father's ruthless spirit, tempered by her own unique blend of courage and compassion. Chapter 3. The Serpent's Gaze, a Heart Ensnared. The morning light, filtered through the heavy damask curtains, painted the room in shades of muted gold. Bianca had barely slept, tossing and turning in the oversized bed that suddenly felt vast and empty. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind, a relentless loop of fear, anger, and a growing, unsettling fascination with the man who held her fate in his hands. She rose, her body stiff and aching, and walked to the window. The city below was already bustling with life, the sounds of traffic and distant voices drifting up to her. It was a world that seemed utterly detached from her own, a world of normalcy and routine that she could no longer access. She needed to think, to strategize. She needed to understand Matteo Greco, to find his weaknesses, to exploit any advantage she could find. But her mind felt clouded, her thoughts scattered. She felt like a bird trapped in a gilded cage, its wings clipped, its spirit slowly eroding. She decided to visit her Nana, Isabella Vitali. Her grandmother, her father's mother, was a formidable woman, a pillar of strength and wisdom. She had lived through her own share of mafia wars and family tragedies, and Bianca hoped she might offer some guidance, some perspective. Isabella lived in a smaller, more modest villa on the outskirts of the city, a place filled with the comforting sense of rosemary, lavender, and freshly baked bread. Her Nana greeted her with a warm embrace, her wrinkled face etched with concern. "Bianca, mia cara, you look pale," Isabella said, her voice raspy with age, but still strong. "What has happened?" Bianca hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She knew her Nana was fiercely loyal to her son, but she also suspected that Isabella had always disapproved of Lorenzo's more ruthless tendencies. She told her grandmother the truth, haltingly at first, then with growing urgency, pouring out her fears, her anger, her sense of betrayal. Isabella listened patiently, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. When Bianca finished, Isabella sighed, a long, weary sound. "Your father, he always played with fire," she said. "And now, you are caught in the flames. What do I do, Nana?" Bianca asked, her voice pleading. "I don't want to marry him. He's a monster." Isabella reached out, taking Bianca's hand in hers. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "He is a Greco," she said, her voice firm. "And the Grecos are not known for their kindness. But they are also known for their honor in their own way. They keep their word."
Honor? Bianca scoffed.
"He's forcing me to marry him." "He is honoring the debt your father incurred," Isabella corrected. "It is the way of our world, Cara. A debt must be paid." "But it's not my debt," Bianca protested. "No," Isabella agreed. "But you are your father's daughter, and you carry his name. You must bear the consequences of his actions." Bianca felt a surge of anger, both at her father and at the archaic, unforgiving code that governed their lives. But she also knew her Nana was right. There was no escaping the reality of her situation. Is there any way out?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Isabella studied her for a long moment, her gaze piercing. "There is always a way," she said. "But it may require sacrifices. You must be strong, Bianca. You must be clever. You must learn to play the game." "But I don't know the game," Bianca said, her voice filled with despair. "You will learn," Isabella said, her voice firm. "You have the blood of the Vitales in your veins. You are stronger than you think." Her grandmother's words gave her a small measure of comfort, a flicker of hope in the darkness. She spent the rest of the day with Isabella, listening to her stories of the past, learning about the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that define their world. She learned about the Grecos, their history, their strengths, their weaknesses. As the day wore on, Bianca began to formulate a plan. It was a dangerous plan, a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance she had. She would marry Matteo Greco. She would enter his world, learn his secrets, and find a way to protect herself and, if possible, to reclaim her life. She returned to the mansion late in the afternoon, feeling a strange mixture of dread and determination. She had a few hours left before Matteo returned. She used the time to prepare herself, both mentally and physically. She chose a dress that was both elegant and understated, a deep emerald green that accentuated her dark hair and fair skin. She applied her makeup carefully, creating a mask of composure, hiding the fear and uncertainty that churned beneath the surface. She wanted to appear strong, confident, not the frightened girl he had seen the night before. She was standing in the foyer, her heart pounding, when she heard the knock at the door. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation to come. She opened the door, and there he was, Matteo Greco, even more imposing in the dim light of the evening. He was dressed in a dark suit that fit him perfectly, accentuating his broad shoulders and lean physique. His eyes, those dark, intense eyes, swept over her, taking in every detail. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice a low murmur. It wasn't a compliment, not really. It was an assessment, an acknowledgement of her value as a prize. Bianca met his gaze, her chin held high. "I have made my decision," she said, her voice steady. "I will marry you, Signore Greco." He smiled, that slow, predatory smile that sent a shiver down her spine. But this time, Bianca didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a newfound determination. The serpent had gazed upon her, and she had gazed back. The game had begun, and Bianca Vitali, the sheltered daughter of a fallen dawn, was ready to play. The snare was set, by him, for her, ostensibly. Yet, a flicker of doubt, a shadow of uncertainty, crossed his otherwise impassive features, a fleeting hint that perhaps, just perhaps, he had underestimated the woman standing before him. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Dark, Echoes of the Past. The marriage was swift, devoid of the lavish celebrations that usually accompanied mafia unions. It was a private ceremony, held in the small, ornate chapel within the Greco estate, a sprawling compound on the outskirts of Palermo. Only a handful of people were present. Isabella Vitali, representing Bianca's family, Don Angelo, Matteo's aged but still formidable uncle, who served as the capo of the Greco family, and a few of Matteo's closest lieutenants. The atmosphere was tense, heavy with unspoken implications. Bianca felt like a lamb being led to the slaughter, her white dress a stark contrast to the dark suits and somber faces surrounding her. She repeated her vows mechanically, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on the crucifix above the altar, seeking solace in a faith that felt increasingly distant. Matteo's vows, on the other hand, were delivered with a chilling conviction, his voice resonating with power and possessiveness. He placed a heavy gold ring on her finger, a symbol of ownership, of the unbreakable bond that now tied them together. It felt cold against her skin, a constant reminder of her gilded cage. After the ceremony, there was a small, strained reception in the Greco mansion's grand dining room. The food was exquisite, the wine flowed freely, but the conversation was stilted, the laughter forced. Bianca felt like an outsider, a stranger in this opulent, unfamiliar world. She noticed the way the other men looked at her, a mixture of curiosity, respect, and a hint of pity. They knew she was a pawn in this game, a prize to be won, a symbol of Matteo's victory over her father. Don Angelo, a wizened old man with piercing blue eyes and a surprisingly gentle demeanor, approached her at one point. "Welcome to the family, Bianca," he said, his voice raspy with age. "You are a brave woman." "Thank you, Don Angelo," Bianca replied, forcing a smile. "Matteo, he is a complex man," Angelo continued, his gaze shifting towards his nephew, who was engaged in a conversation with one of his lieutenants. "He has known much darkness in his life. But he is also capable of great loyalty." Bianca doubted that. She had seen only the darkness in Matteo, the cold, calculating ruthlessness. But she nodded politely, acknowledging the old man's words. As the evening wore on, Bianca found herself increasingly drawn to the periphery, seeking refuge in the shadows. She felt suffocated by the opulence, the veiled threats, the constant scrutiny. She longed for the simplicity of her former life, for the freedom she had taken for granted. She slipped out onto the terrace, seeking a breath of fresh air. The night was cool, the sky a tapestry of stars. The sounds of the city, muted by distance, drifted up to her. She closed her eyes, trying to find a moment of peace, a moment of escape. "Enjoying the view?" She startled, turning to find Matteo standing behind her, his presence as imposing as ever. He had shed his jacket, his white shirt gleaming in the moonlight. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice hesitant. He moved closer, standing beside her, his gaze fixed on the distant lights of the city. "Palermo is a city of secrets," he said, his voice low and reflective. "A city of shadows. A city of betrayal." Bianca shivered, not from the cold, but from the ominous tone of his voice. She wondered what secrets he held, what darkness lurked beneath his carefully constructed facade. "My father, he told me stories," Matteo continued, his voice taking on a nostalgic quality. "Stories of our ancestors, of the battles they fought, the sacrifices they made. He taught me the importance of loyalty, of family, of honor." Bianca listened, intrigued despite herself. She had never heard him speak of his father before, had never seen this hint of vulnerability. "But he also taught me other things," Matteo said, his voice hardening. "He taught me that the world is a cruel place, that trust is a weakness, that only the strong survive." He turned to her, his eyes piercing in the moonlight. "Do you understand, Bianca?" he asked. "Do you understand the rules of this world?" I am learning," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a touch that was both possessive and strangely gentle. Bianca flinched, but she didn't pull away. "You are a Vitali," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You have strength in your blood, but you also have a softness, a vulnerability. That could be your undoing. Or it could be my strength," Bianca countered, her voice gaining a hint of defiance. She wouldn't let him see her fear, her weakness. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Perhaps," he said, "perhaps you are stronger than you appear. But be warned, Kara. This world will test you. It will break you. Or it will make you." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. A servant silently appeared, lighting strategically placed torches that cast flickering, dramatic shadows. "And I," he whispered, "intend to be the one to do both." The flames highlighted the stark planes of his face, the intensity of his gaze. His words were a promise, a threat, and a challenge, all intertwined. A promise of protection, a threat of dominance, and a challenge to her spirit. Bianca knew, with a chilling certainty, that her life with Matteo Greco would be a constant battle, a dance of shadows where the lines between love and hate, fear and desire, were blurred beyond recognition. Chapter 5. The Lioness in the Gilded Cage. The days that followed were a blur of unsettling routine. Bianca found herself adrift in a sea of unfamiliar faces, customs, and expectations. The Greco mansion, a sprawling labyrinth of opulent rooms, hidden passages, and heavily guarded courtyards, felt more like a prison than a home. She was treated with a strange mixture of respect and distance, the servants deferential but wary, the family members polite but guarded. She spent her days exploring the mansion, trying to familiarize herself with its layout, its secrets. She discovered a hidden library, filled with ancient texts and dusty manuscripts, a place where she could escape the suffocating atmosphere of the main house. She spent hours there, losing herself in the stories of the past, seeking solace in the written word. She also began to observe Matteo, studying his habits, his routines, his interactions with others. She watched him from afar, a silent observer, trying to decipher the enigma that he was. She saw the ruthless businessman, the cold, calculating strategist, the feared and respected leader. But she also glimpsed moments of vulnerability, fleeting expressions of sadness, of loneliness, that hinted at a deeper, more complex man beneath the surface. She learned that Matteo had lost his mother at a young age, a tragedy that had profoundly affected him, shaping him into the hardened, emotionally guarded man he was today. His father, a demanding and distant figure, had instilled in him a fierce sense of loyalty, a ruthless ambition, and a deep distrust of the world outside their family. Bianca also discovered that Matteo was deeply involved in the family's businesses, the intricate web of legal and illegal enterprises that formed the foundation of their power and wealth. She overheard whispered conversations, saw coded messages being exchanged, witnessed the comings and goings of shadowy figures who seemed to operate outside the law. She realized that she was living in a world of constant danger, a world where betrayal was commonplace and loyalty was a commodity to be bought and sold. She had to be careful, to be vigilant, to trust no one. One evening, she found herself alone with Matteo in the library. He was sitting in a large leather armchair, reading a book, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a table lamp. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "You seem to enjoy this place," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It's peaceful," Bianca replied, choosing her words carefully. He closed the book, setting it aside. "Peace is a rare commodity in our world," he said. "Perhaps that's why I seek it," Bianca said, her voice gaining a hint of defiance. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense. "You are different from the other women in this family," he said. "You are not afraid to speak your mind." "Should I be?" Bianca asked, meeting his gaze. He smiled a slow, knowing smile.
"Perhaps," he said.
"But it is also refreshing." He rose from the chair, moving towards her. Bianca felt a surge of nervousness, but she stood her ground. "You are still a mystery to me, Bianca," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I don't understand you." "And you, Matteo, are a mystery to me," Bianca replied. "I don't understand you." He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a touch that was both possessive and strangely gentle. Bianca flinched, but she didn't pull away. "Perhaps that is what makes this arrangement so intriguing," he said, his voice a silken caress. "The challenge of unraveling each other's secrets." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "But be warned, Kara," he whispered. "Some secrets are best left buried. Some doors are best left unopened." He pulled away, leaving her standing there, her heart pounding, her mind racing. His words were a warning, a threat, but they also held a hint of something else, something that intrigued her, challenged her. She was beginning to realize that this marriage, this forced union, was more than just a business transaction. It was a game of cat and mouse, a dance of shadows, a battle of wills. And Bianca, the lioness in the gilded cage, was determined to play the game, to win, to survive. She was learning to navigate the treacherous currents of this new world, to use her intelligence, her intuition, her inherent strength, to protect herself. She was discovering a resilience she never knew she possessed, a fierceness that mirrored the man she was bound to, yet burned with a distinctly feminine fire. The cage might be gilded, but she was no longer a frightened bird. She was a lioness, learning to roar. Chapter 6. Masks of Civility, Undercurrents of War. Life within the Greco compound settled into a tense equilibrium. Bianca continued her explorations, both physical and metaphorical, of the world she now inhabited. She learned the names and faces of Matteo's lieutenants, the intricate hierarchy of the family, the unspoken rules that governed their lives. She also began to understand the complex web of alliances and rivalries that existed between the Greco family and other mafia clans in Palermo and beyond. She discovered that the peace that Don Angelo had spoken of was a fragile one, maintained by a delicate balance of power, constant vigilance, and the ever-present threat of violence. There were whispers of discontent, of challenges to Matteo's authority, of old vendettas simmering beneath the surface. One evening, a formal dinner was held at the mansion, a gathering of the extended Greco family and some of their closest allies. Bianca was expected to play the role of the dutiful wife, to be seen and not heard, to smile and nod and make polite conversation. She dressed in a gown of deep crimson, a color that Matteo favored, a color that seemed to symbolize both passion and danger. She applied her makeup carefully, creating a mask of composure, hiding the turmoil that churned beneath the surface. The dinner was a lavish affair, the table laden with exquisite food and expensive wine. The conversation flowed around her, a mixture of business, politics, and family gossip. Bianca listened, observing, trying to decipher the hidden meanings, the unspoken threats, the subtle power plays. She noticed the way some of the older men looked at Matteo, a mixture of respect and resentment. They remembered his father, the formidable Don Lorenzo, and they saw in Matteo a reflection of his father's ruthlessness, but also a hint of something different, something more unpredictable. There was one man in particular, Don Salvatore Rossi, the head of a rival family, who seemed to be watching Matteo with a particular intensity. Rossi was a large, imposing man with a cruel face and a reputation for violence. He had been a longtime enemy of Matteo's father, and Bianca sensed that the animosity between them had not diminished with the passing of time. During a lull in the conversation, Rossi turned to Bianca, his eyes cold and calculating. "Signorina Vitali," he said, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "Or should I say, Signora Greco? You are a surprising addition to this family." Bianca met his gaze, her chin held high. "I am honored to be a part of the Greco family, Don Rossi," she replied, her voice steady. "Honored?" Rossi scoffed. "Or trapped?" Bianca felt a surge of anger, but she maintained her composure. "I am where I am meant to be," she said. Rossi smiled, a cruel, unpleasant smile.
"We shall see," he said. "We shall see."
Matteo, who had been observing the exchange, intervened. "Don Rossi," he said, his voice dangerously low. "My wife is under my protection. I suggest you remember that." Rossi met Matteo's gaze, his eyes filled with hatred. "Of course, Don Matteo," he said. "I would not dream of disrespecting your wife." The tension in the room was palpable. Bianca felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew that this was more than just a social gathering. It was a display of power, a testing of boundaries, a prelude to war. Later that evening, after the guests had departed, Bianca found Matteo in his study, staring out the window at the darkened city below. He turned as she entered, his expression grim. "Rossi is a snake," he said, his voice filled with anger. "He is looking for any weakness, any opportunity to strike." "He seemed to dislike me," Bianca said, her voice hesitant. Matteo sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "It's not you, Cara," he said. "It's me. He hates me. He hates my family. He wants what we have." "And what is that?" Bianca asked. "Power," Matteo said, his voice flat. "Control. Respect. Everything." He turned to her, his eyes intense. "This world is a battlefield, Bianca," he said. "And we're all soldiers. We fight for survival, for dominance, for the right to exist." "And is there no other way?" Bianca asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps," he said. "But I have never known it." He moved closer, his presence overwhelming. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a touch that was both possessive and strangely tender. "You are a complication, Bianca," he said, his voice a low murmur. "A distraction. A weakness. But you are also something more. Something I cannot quite define." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "I do not know whether to protect you or to destroy you. It's an irritating predicament." The admission, raw and unexpected, hung between them. He was admitting a vulnerability, a crack in his armor. His words, and the intensity of his gaze, sent a shiver through her, a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling excitement. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, walking a tightrope between survival and destruction. But she was also beginning to understand the man she was bound to, the forces that shaped him, the demons that haunted him. And in that understanding, she found a glimmer of hope, a possibility of connection, a flicker of something that might, one day, become more. The masks of civility were fragile, she realized, and beneath them lay a volatile world ready to erupt. Chapter 7. A Dance of Shadows, a Touch of Truth. The tension between the Greco and Rossi families escalated in the weeks following the dinner. There were incidents, subtle acts of sabotage, veiled threats exchanged between lieutenants. Bianca found herself increasingly caught in the middle, a pawn in a dangerous game of power. She tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, to find moments of peace amidst the chaos. She continued her explorations of the mansion, her quiet conversations with Isabella, her attempts to understand Matteo. She discovered a hidden garden, a secluded oasis of tranquility within the heavily guarded compound. It was a small, walled garden filled with fragrant flowers, a bubbling fountain, and a weathered stone bench. She spent hours there, reading, reflecting, trying to make sense of her new life. One afternoon, she was sitting in the garden, lost in thought, when she heard a sound behind her. She turned to find Matteo standing there, watching her. He was dressed casually, in a dark shirt and trousers, his usual aura of formality relaxed. "I didn't know you came here," he said, his voice soft. "It's peaceful," Bianca replied, her voice hesitant. He moved closer, sitting beside her on the bench. The silence between them was comfortable, surprisingly so. "My mother loved this garden," he said, his voice taking on a nostalgic quality. "She used to spend hours here, tending the flowers." Bianca looked at him, surprised. She had never heard him speak of his mother with such tenderness. "What was she like?" she asked. He smiled, a faint, wistful smile. "She was beautiful," he said. "Gentle.
Kind.
Everything I am not." He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant fountain. "She died when I was young," he said. "I barely remember her." Bianca felt a surge of empathy for him. She understood the pain of loss, the void left by the absence of a loved one. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice sincere. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a sadness she had never seen before. "It was a long time ago," he said. "But some wounds never fully heal." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the gentle murmur of the fountain. Bianca felt a connection to him, a shared understanding of loss and pain that transcended their circumstances, their forced union. "My father, he changed after she died," Matteo continued, his voice low and reflective. "He became harder, colder. He taught me to be the same." "But you're not," Bianca said, her voice barely a whisper. "Not entirely." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "What makes you say that?" "I see it," Bianca said. "In the way you protect your family. In the way you look at me sometimes." He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek, a touch that was both possessive and strangely gentle. Bianca shivered, but she didn't pull away. "You see too much, Cara," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You see things I try to hide." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. The scent of his cologne, that familiar dark and spicy fragrance, filled her senses. She closed her eyes, feeling a strange mixture of fear and desire, of repulsion and attraction. He kissed her, then a slow, deliberate kiss that was both tentative and demanding. It wasn't a brutal, possessive kiss, like the ones he had given her before. It was something different, something softer, something that hinted at a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. Bianca responded, hesitantly at first, then with growing passion. She found herself drawn to him, to the darkness and the light, to the strength and the vulnerability, to the man she was beginning to understand, to the man she was beginning to care for. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more demanding. Bianca felt herself losing control, surrendering to the moment, to the emotions that had been building within her since the day they met. He pulled away, abruptly, his breathing ragged. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of desire and confusion. This is a mistake," he said, his voice hoarse.
"Is it?"
Bianca asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. He stood up, turning away from her. "I have to go," he said. "There are things I need to take care of." He left, disappearing into the shadows of the mansion, leaving Bianca alone in the garden, her heart pounding, her mind racing. The kiss had changed everything. It had shattered the carefully constructed walls between them, revealing a glimpse of the truth, a hint of the connection that existed beneath the surface. It was a dangerous truth, a forbidden connection, but it was also undeniable. Bianca knew that she was playing with fire, that she was risking everything by allowing herself to feel something for this man, this devil. But she couldn't help herself. She was drawn to him, to his darkness, to his vulnerability, to the man she was beginning to believe he could be. The dance of shadows had taken a new turn, a dangerous, exhilarating turn. And Bianca, the lioness, was no longer just surviving, she was embracing the dance, the danger, the possibility of a truth that could either save her or destroy her. The touch of truth had ignited a flame that threatened to consume them both. Chapter 8. Scars of the Past, Seeds of the Future. The aftermath of the kiss in the garden hung heavy in the air between Bianca and Matteo. They avoided each other for days, the unspoken tension thick and palpable. Bianca found herself replaying the moment in her mind, analyzing every touch, every glance, every whispered word. She was confused, conflicted, torn between her fear of Matteo and the undeniable attraction she felt for him. She threw herself into her routine, seeking solace in the familiar rhythms of her life within the Greco compound. She continued her visits to the library, her quiet conversations with Isabella, her careful observations of the family dynamics. She learned more about Matteo's past, piecing together fragments of information from overheard conversations, from Isabella's guarded revelations, from her own observations. She discovered that he had been involved in a violent incident years ago, a confrontation with a rival family that had left him scarred, both physically and emotionally. She saw the scar one evening, when he was changing for dinner. He had his back to her, and she caught a glimpse of a long, jagged scar that ran across his shoulder blade. It was a stark reminder of the violence that was woven into the fabric of his life, of the dangers he faced every day. She wanted to ask him about it, to understand the story behind the scar, but she hesitated, unsure how he would react. She knew he was a private man, fiercely protective of his emotions, reluctant to reveal any weakness. One afternoon, she found him in the stables, tending to his favorite horse, a magnificent black stallion named Nero. He was brushing the horse's coat, his movements slow and deliberate, his face relaxed and unguarded. Bianca approached him cautiously, her heart pounding. "He's beautiful," she said, her voice soft. Matteo looked up, surprised to see her. He nodded, a slight smile playing on his lips.
He is, he said.
"He's also unpredictable. Like me." Bianca smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I can see the resemblance," she said. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that was surprisingly pleasant. He continued brushing the horse, his movements rhythmic and soothing. Bianca watched him for a while, feeling a strange sense of peace in his presence. She decided to take a chance, to ask him about the scar. "Matteo," she said, her voice hesitant. I saw your scar." He stiffened, his hand pausing in its movements. He turned to her, his expression guarded. "It's nothing," he said. "It's not nothing," Bianca said, her voice firm. "It's a part of you. A part of your past." He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching. He seemed to be weighing his options, deciding whether to trust her, to reveal a piece of himself. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "It was a long time ago," he said. "A fight. A mistake." "Tell me," Bianca said, her voice gentle. He hesitated, then began to speak, his voice low and reluctant. He told her about the incident, about the ambush, the betrayal, the violence. He told her about the pain, the fear, the anger. As he spoke, Bianca saw a different side of him, a vulnerable, wounded side that he usually kept hidden. She listened patiently, offering him silent support, a space to share his pain. When he finished, he looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and relief. "I have never told anyone that before," he said. "I'm glad you told me," Bianca said, her voice sincere. She reached out, her fingers gently touching the scar on his shoulder blade. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. "It doesn't define you, Matteo," she said. "It's just a part of your story." He looked at her, his gaze intense. You see me," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You see past the mask." "I try," Bianca said, her voice barely a whisper. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. He kissed her, then a slow, tender kiss that was different from the ones before. It was a kiss of gratitude, of vulnerability, of connection. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent. Bianca responded, her heart overflowing with a mixture of emotions, compassion, empathy, and a growing, undeniable love. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked. The scars of the past were still there, but they were no longer a barrier between them. They were a bridge, a connection, a shared understanding of pain and resilience. In that moment, Bianca knew that her feelings for Matteo had deepened, had transformed into something more profound, more enduring. She was still afraid of him, of his world, of the dangers that surrounded them. But she was also in love with him, with the man beneath the mask, with the wounded soul she had glimpsed. The seeds of the future were planted, seeds of hope, of healing, of a love that could potentially bloom even in the darkest of soils. The past had left its mark, but it no longer held them captive. They were beginning, tentatively, to write their own story. Chapter 9. The Unseen Threads, the Woven Fates. The tentative intimacy that had blossomed between Bianca and Matteo in the stables began to weave its way into their daily lives. The walls between them, once seemingly impenetrable, started to crumble, replaced by a fragile understanding, a hesitant trust. They still had their moments of tension, their clashes of will, but there was a new undercurrent of respect, of affection, that softened the edges of their interactions. Bianca continued her explorations of the Greco family and their world, but now she did so with a new perspective, a deeper understanding of the complexities and contradictions that define their existence. She saw the loyalty, the fierce protectiveness, the unwavering commitment to family, but she also saw the ruthlessness, the violence, the constant threat of betrayal. She began to understand Matteo's position, the weight of responsibility he carried, the constant pressure he faced to maintain control, to protect his family, to uphold the traditions and codes of their world. She saw the toll it took on him, the weariness in his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the occasional glimpses of vulnerability that he tried so hard to conceal. She also began to see her own role in this world, not just as a pawn in a power game, but as a potential force for change, a bridge between the old ways and a new, more hopeful future. She used her intelligence, her empathy, her growing understanding of the mafia dynamics to navigate the treacherous currents, to build alliances, to subtly influence events. She became particularly close to Don Angelo, Matteo's uncle, who seemed to recognize her potential, her strength of character. He shared with her stories of the past, of the family's history, of the challenges they had faced, the sacrifices they had made. He also offered her guidance, subtle hints, and warnings, helping her to navigate the complex web of relationships and rivalries. One evening, Angelo summoned Bianca to his private study, a small, book-lined room filled with the scent of old leather and pipe tobacco. He was sitting in a large armchair, his aged face etched with concern. "Bianca, mia cara," he said, his voice raspy with age. "I need to speak with you. It is about Matteo." Bianca felt a surge of apprehension. "What is it, Don Angelo?" she asked. Angelo sighed, his gaze shifting towards the window. "There are whispers," he said. "Rumors of a plot. A challenge to Matteo's leadership." Bianca's heart pounded. She knew that this was a constant threat, the ever-present danger of betrayal and violence. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Rossi, of course," Angelo said, his voice grim. "But he is not alone. There are others within our own family who are dissatisfied with Matteo, who believe he is too soft, too weak." Bianca felt a surge of anger, both at the betrayal and at the accusation. She knew that Matteo was not weak. He was strong, resilient, but he was also burdened by the weight of his past, by the expectations of his family, by the constant pressure to live up to his father's legacy. "What can I do?" Bianca asked, her voice firm. Angelo looked at her, his gaze piercing. "You can be his strength," he said. "You can be his confidant. You can help him to see the truth, to navigate the dangers that lie ahead." "I will try," Bianca said, her voice trembling slightly.
Angelo smiled, a faint, wistful smile.
"You are a Vitali," he said. "You have the strength of your ancestors in your blood. You are more than capable." He reached out, taking her hand in his. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Matteo, he is a good man, Bianca," he said. But he is also lost.
He needs you.
More than he realizes. Bianca nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew that she was facing a formidable challenge, that she was walking a tightrope between survival and destruction. But she was no longer alone. She had Matteo, she had Angelo, and she had her own inner strength, her own unwavering commitment to the man she loved. She left Angelo's study, her mind racing. She needed to talk to Matteo, to warn him, to help him prepare for the coming storm. She found him in the library, reading a book, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a table lamp. He looked up as she entered, his expression guarded. "We need to talk," Bianca said, her voice urgent. He closed the book, setting it aside. "What is it?" he asked. Bianca told him what Angelo had said about the rumors, the plot, the betrayal. Matteo listened patiently, his expression hardening with each word. When she finished, he nodded, his jaw clenched. "I knew it," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I knew Rossi would not let it go. But there are others," Bianca said, her voice filled with concern.
"Within your own family."
Matteo sighed, running a hand through his dark hair.
"There are always those who are dissatisfied," he said.
"Those who crave power. Those who believe they can do better. What will you do?" Bianca asked. He looked at her, his eyes intense. "I will fight," he said. "I will protect my family. I will crush anyone who dares to challenge me." His words were filled with a cold, ruthless determination that both frightened and impressed her. She knew that he was capable of great violence, of terrible things. But she also knew that he was fighting for something more than just power. He was fighting for his family, for his legacy, for the woman he loved. Bianca reached out, taking his hand in hers. "We will fight together," she said, her voice firm. The unseen threads of their lives had woven together, creating a bond that was stronger than any threat, any betrayal. Their fates were intertwined, their destinies linked. And together, they would face the coming storm, the inevitable confrontation, with courage, determination, and a love that had blossomed in the heart of darkness. Chapter 10. Broken Vows. Rekindled Flames. The whispers of conspiracy grew louder, the tension within the Greco compound thicker. Bianca and Matteo worked together, a united front against the looming threat. They spent hours poring over ledgers, analyzing reports, trying to identify the traitors within their ranks. Bianca's sharp intellect and intuitive understanding of human nature proved invaluable, complementing Matteo's strategic mind and ruthless determination. They discovered that Rossi had been forging alliances with several key figures within the Greco family, promising them power and wealth in exchange for their loyalty. The betrayal cut deep, especially for Matteo, who had always valued family above all else. One evening, they were working late in Matteo's study, the room illuminated by the soft glow of a desk lamp. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and the faint aroma of Matteo's cologne. They were going over a list of names, trying to determine who could be trusted and who was likely to be involved in the plot. "This is disheartening," Bianca said, her voice filled with frustration. "These are people you grew up with, people you considered family." Matteo sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Loyalty is a fickle thing, Cara," he said. "Especially in our world." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "I trusted them," he said. "I believed in them." Bianca reached out, taking his hand in hers. "I know," she said, her voice gentle. "But you can't blame yourself. You can't control the choices of others." He squeezed her hand, his grip tight. "I should have seen it coming," he said. "I should have been more vigilant." "You can't be everywhere at once, Matteo," Bianca said. "You can't anticipate every betrayal." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "But I can protect you," he said, his voice firm. "I will protect you from this. From all of it." His words were a vow, a promise, and Bianca felt a surge of love for him, a deep, unwavering commitment that transcended their circumstances, their forced union. "I know you will," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. He kissed her, then a slow, tender kiss that was filled with a mixture of passion and desperation. It was a kiss that spoke of their shared vulnerability, their growing love, their unwavering determination to face the future together. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more demanding. Bianca responded, her heart overflowing with emotion. They clung to each other, seeking solace in the midst of the storm, finding strength in their connection. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked. The world outside the study, the world of betrayal and violence, seemed to fade away, replaced by the intimacy of the moment, the undeniable bond between them. But the reality of their situation soon intruded. A sharp knock at the door shattered the silence. Mateo's face hardened, his eyes narrowing.
Who is it?
He called out, his voice cold and commanding. It's Marco, Don Mateo, came the reply. Marco was one of Mateo's most trusted lieutenants. We have a problem. Mateo exchanged a look with Bianca, his expression grim.
Come in, he said.
Marco entered the room, his face pale and strained.
Don Rossi, he's made his move, he said.
He's gathered his men. They're heading this way. Mateo nodded, his jaw clenched.
It's time, he said.
He turned to Bianca, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and concern.
Stay here, he said.
Stay safe. No, Bianca said, her voice firm. I'm going with you. Mateo hesitated, his gaze searching. He knew she was stubborn, determined, that she wouldn't be easily dissuaded. It's too dangerous, he said. I'm not afraid, Bianca said. I'm with you. Always. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression softening. He knew she meant it, that she was willing to risk everything for him, for their family. All right, he said, his voice resigned. But stay close to me, and do as I say. They left the study, joining Marco and a group of Mateo's loyal men. The mansion was buzzing with activity, the servants scurrying to secure the doors and windows, the guards taking up their positions. As they headed towards the main entrance, where Rossi and his men were expected to arrive, Bianca felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and excitement. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been forced to marry a mafia don. She was a warrior, a partner, a woman fighting for her life, for her love, for her future. The vows they had made in the chapel had been broken, shattered by the circumstances of their forced union. But in the face of danger, in the crucible of conflict, new vows were being forged, vows of love, of loyalty, of unwavering commitment. The flames of their relationship, once sparked by a forced marriage, were now rekindled, burning brighter and stronger than ever before. Chapter 11. The Serpent's Coil, the Tightening Grip. The night air was thick with anticipation as Mateo, Bianca, and his loyal men prepared for Rossi's arrival. The mansion, usually a beacon of opulence and power, felt like a fortress under siege. The sounds of the city, usually a distant hum, were replaced by the nervous whispers of the guards, the clinking of weapons, the heavy thud of barricades being put in place. Bianca stayed close to Mateo, her hand gripping his, her presence a source of strength and comfort. She could feel the tension radiating from him, the coiled energy of a predator ready to strike. She knew he was worried, not for himself, but for her, for the safety of his family. Are you sure you want to do this? He asked, his voice low and urgent, his eyes searching hers. You don't have to be here. I'm not leaving your side, Bianca said, her voice firm. We face this together. He nodded, his grip tightening on her hand. He knew she was right, that they were stronger together, that their love, their shared commitment, was their greatest weapon. They took up their positions in the grand foyer, the main entrance to the mansion. The heavy oak doors were barricaded, the windows shuttered, the only light coming from a few strategically placed lamps that cast long, dancing shadows. They waited. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house, the distant sound of sirens, the nervous breathing of the men. Bianca felt her heart pounding, her senses heightened, her mind racing. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, the sound of splintering wood, as Rossi and his men forced their way into the mansion. The battle had begun. Gunfire erupted, shattering the silence, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the screams of men, the thud of bodies hitting the floor. Matteo moved swiftly, efficiently, a deadly force, protecting Bianca while simultaneously directing his men. Bianca stayed close to him, her eyes scanning the chaos, looking for any sign of danger. She saw Rossi, his face contorted with rage, his eyes fixed on Matteo. He was a large, imposing man, wielding a shotgun, his movements brutal and unforgiving.
Greco.
Rossi roared, his voice echoing through the foyer. This ends tonight. It ends with you, Rossi. Matteo shouted back, his voice filled with cold fury. The two men faced each other, their hatred palpable, their determination unwavering. They were the leaders, the symbols of their respective families, their conflict the culmination of years of rivalry, of betrayal, of violence. The fighting continued around them, a chaotic melee of men struggling for dominance. Bianca saw Marco, Matteo's loyal lieutenant, fall to the ground, a bullet wound in his chest. She gasped, her heart aching for the fallen man. She saw other men fall, on both sides, the floor stained with blood, the air filled with the cries of the wounded and the dying. She felt a surge of anger, of revulsion, at the senseless violence, the waste of human life. Suddenly, she saw Rossi raise his shotgun, aiming it directly at Matteo. Time seemed to slow down, her senses sharpened, her mind focused. She knew she had to act, to protect the man she loved. Without thinking, she pushed Matteo out of the way, throwing herself in front of him, shielding him with her own body. The shotgun blast rang out, deafeningly loud, and Bianca felt a searing pain in her shoulder. She cried out, stumbling, falling into Matteo's arms. He caught her, his eyes filled with horror, his face pale with shock.
Bianca,
he shouted, his voice raw with anguish. He cradled her in his arms, his hands pressing against the wound, trying to stem the flow of blood. He looked around, desperately for help. Get a doctor. He roared, his voice filled with desperation. The fighting continued around them, but Matteo's focus was entirely on Bianca. He held her close, whispering words of comfort, of love, of reassurance. Stay with me, Cara, he pleaded, his voice trembling. Stay with me. I love you. I can't lose you. Bianca looked up at him, her vision blurred, her body racked with pain. She smiled, a faint, weak smile. I love you too, Matteo, she whispered, her voice barely audible. She closed her eyes, her body going limp in his arms. The serpent's coil had tightened, its grip seemingly unbreakable. The violence had reached its crescendo, and Bianca, the lioness, had been struck down, protecting the man she loved. The future was uncertain, the outcome unknown, but in that moment of sacrifice, of unwavering love, a profound truth had been revealed. Even in the darkest of worlds, love could bloom, love could endure, love could conquer all. Chapter 12. Echoes of Betrayal, Whispers of Hope. The world was a blur of pain and confusion for Bianca. She drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of voices, of hands touching her, of the frantic activity surrounding her. She heard Matteo's voice, his desperate pleas, his whispered words of love, and she clung to them, drawing strength from his presence. She was carried to a room, a makeshift infirmary that had been set up in one of the mansion's guest bedrooms. A doctor, one of the family's trusted physicians, worked feverishly to staunch the bleeding, to repair the damage caused by the shotgun blast. Matteo never left her side, holding her hand, stroking her hair, whispering words of encouragement. He looked haggard, his face pale and drawn, his eyes red-rimmed with worry and lack of sleep. The surgery was long and arduous, the doctor working with a grim determination. The bullet had narrowly missed her vital organs, but it had caused significant damage to her shoulder and arm. There was a risk of infection, of permanent nerve damage, of losing the use of her arm. After what seemed like an eternity, the doctor finally straightened up, his face etched with exhaustion. She's stable, he said, his voice hoarse. but she's lost a lot of blood. She needs rest.
And time.
Matteo let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief. He looked at Bianca, his heart overflowing with love and gratitude. She was alive. She was going to be all right. He stayed with her throughout the night, watching over her, praying for her recovery. He refused to leave her side, even for a moment, fearing that if he did, she might slip away. As dawn broke, Bianca finally opened her eyes. She looked around, disoriented, her mind struggling to make sense of her surroundings. She saw Matteo, sitting beside her bed, his face etched with concern. "Matteo?" she whispered, her voice weak and raspy. He leaned closer, his eyes filled with relief. "Cara," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You're awake. You're alive." He took her hand in his grip gentle but firm. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Sore," Bianca said, her voice barely audible. "My shoulder hurts." "I know," Matteo said, his voice soothing. "But you're going to be all right. The doctor said you're stable." He told her what had happened, about the surgery, about the risks, about the doctor's prognosis. Bianca listened, her mind slowly processing the information. She looked at Matteo, her eyes filled with gratitude. You saved my life," she said. He shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. "No, Cara," he said. "You saved mine. You took the bullet for me. I couldn't let him hurt you," Bianca said, her voice trembling. He leaned down, kissing her forehead, his lips lingering on her skin. "I love you, Bianca," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I love you more than words can say." "I love you too, Matteo," Bianca whispered. They stayed there, together, in the quiet of the room, the bond between them stronger than ever before. The echoes of betrayal still lingered, the threat of Rossi and his allies still loomed, but for now, all that mattered was their love, their survival, their shared hope for the future. As Bianca drifted back to sleep, exhausted but at peace, she heard Matteo whispering to her, his voice filled with a tenderness she had never heard before. "Rest now, Cara," he said. "Heal. And when you are strong enough, we will face the world together. We will rebuild. We will create a new future. A future where love, not violence, reigns." His words were a promise, a vow, and Bianca, drifting in the realm between sleep and wakefulness, felt a glimmer of hope, a whisper of a brighter tomorrow. The battle had been fierce, the wounds deep, but the spirit of love, the resilience of the human heart, had prevailed. Chapter 13. The Price of Freedom, the Cost of Love. Bianca's recovery was slow and painful. The physical wounds began to heal, but the emotional scars ran deeper. She had nightmares, reliving the moment of the shooting, the fear, the pain, the overwhelming sense of vulnerability. Matteo was her constant support, her unwavering source of strength and comfort. He stayed by her side, tending to her needs, encouraging her, reminding her of her strength, her resilience. He helped her with her physical therapy, patiently guiding her through the exercises, celebrating her small victories, offering her reassurance during her moments of frustration and despair. He also took care of the business side of things, dealing with the fallout from the attack, consolidating his power, eliminating the remaining threats. He was ruthless, efficient, but he also showed a newfound restraint, a desire to minimize the violence, to find a more peaceful solution whenever possible. Bianca's influence on him was subtle, but profound. She challenged his assumptions, questioned his methods, encouraged him to consider alternative approaches. She reminded him of the human cost of their world, of the suffering and loss that were so often overlooked in the pursuit of power and control. One evening, as Bianca was sitting on the terrace, enjoying the cool night air, Matteo joined her. He sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Better," Bianca said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Stronger." "You are strong, Cara," Matteo said, his eyes filled with admiration. "Stronger than anyone I know." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the gentle rustling of the leaves in the nearby trees. Bianca looked at Matteo, her heart filled with love and gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. For everything. He squeezed her hand, his grip tight. I would do anything for you, Bianca, he said. Anything. I know, she said, her voice barely a whisper. They talked for hours that night, sharing their hopes, their fears, their dreams for the future. They talked about the possibility of leaving Palermo, of escaping the mafia world, of starting a new life together, a life free from violence and fear. It's just a dream, Matteo said, his voice filled with a mixture of longing and resignation. It's not possible. I'm too deeply entrenched. There's too much history, too much blood. But it could be possible, Bianca said, her voice firm. If we were willing to sacrifice everything, to walk away from it all. Matteo looked at her, his eyes searching. He knew she was right, that it was theoretically possible, but he also knew the risks, the dangers, the potential consequences. It would be difficult, he said. Dangerous. We would have enemies. People who would never let us go. But we would have each other, Bianca said. And that's all that matters. They continued to discuss the possibility, weighing the pros and cons, exploring the challenges, acknowledging the risks. It was a daunting prospect, a seemingly impossible dream, but it was also a tantalizing hope, a glimmer of a brighter future. The next day, Matteo made a decision. He called a meeting of the commission, the governing body of the Palermo Mafia families. He announced his intention to step down as capo of the Greco family, to relinquish his power, to leave Palermo and start a new life. The announcement was met with shock, disbelief, and outrage. The other Dons tried to dissuade him, to threaten him, to remind him of his obligations, his responsibilities, his family's legacy. But Matteo was resolute. He had made his decision, and he would not be swayed. He had paid the price of freedom, the cost of love, and he was willing to accept the consequences. He negotiated a deal with the commission, a carefully crafted agreement that would ensure the safety of his family, the protection of his assets, and the peaceful transition of power to his successor, a young, ambitious lieutenant named Alessandro, who had proven himself to be both loyal and capable. The agreement was not without its concessions. Matteo had to give up a significant portion of his wealth, relinquish control of several key businesses, and agree to stay away from Palermo permanently. But it was a price he was willing to pay for the chance to start a new life, a life free from the shadows of the past. The news of Matteo's decision spread quickly through the underworld, causing a ripple effect of shock and uncertainty. Some admired his courage, his willingness to walk away from power. Others condemned him as a traitor, a weakling, a disgrace to his family. But Matteo didn't care. He had made his choice, and he was at peace with it. He had chosen love, he had chosen freedom, and he had chosen Bianca. The price was high, the cost immense, but the reward, a life lived on their own terms, a future filled with hope and possibility, was worth it. The weight of the past, the burden of his family's legacy, had been lifted, replaced by the lightness of freedom, the promise of a new beginning. Chapter 14. A shattered mirror, a glimpse of self. Leaving Palermo was like shedding a skin. It was painful, wrenching, but ultimately liberating. Bianca and Matteo sold the Greco mansion, divested themselves of their remaining assets, and prepared for their departure. They chose to relocate to a small, secluded village in Tuscany, far from the chaos and violence of their former life. They found a villa overlooking rolling hills, vineyards, and olive groves, a place of breathtaking beauty and tranquility. It was a world away from the dark, oppressive atmosphere of the Greco compound, a place where they could breathe freely, heal, and rebuild their lives. The transition was not easy. They were strangers in a new land, with no family, no friends, no connections. They had to learn a new way of life, a new language, a new set of customs. They had to create a new identity for themselves, shedding the weight of their past, embracing the anonymity of their new existence. Bianca struggled with the change at first. She missed the familiarity of Palermo, the bustling streets, the vibrant culture, the sense of belonging, however fraught with danger it had been. She missed her Nana, Isabella, who had chosen to remain in Palermo, believing that her place was with her family, even if it meant living in the shadow of the mafia. Matteo also struggled in his own way. He missed the power, the control, the respect he had commanded as capo of the Greco family. He missed the adrenaline rush of the dangerous game he had played for so long, the thrill of outsmarting his rivals, the satisfaction of victory. But they had each other. They clung to each other, drawing strength from their love, their shared commitment to their new life. They worked together, building a new home, creating a new routine, forging a new identity. They spent their days exploring the countryside, walking hand in hand through vineyards and olive groves, discovering hidden villages and ancient ruins. They learned to cook the local cuisine, to appreciate the simple pleasures of life, to savor the beauty of the natural world. They also spent time talking, sharing their thoughts, their feelings, their hopes, their fears. They talked about their past, about the trauma they had experienced, about the wounds that still needed to heal. One evening, as they were sitting on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple, Bianca turned to Matteo. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Leaving Palermo? Giving up everything?" Matteo looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and contentment. "Sometimes," he admitted, "I miss the excitement, the challenge, the power. But,"
Bianca prompted.
He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes.
"But I don't regret it," he said.
"Not for a moment. I would choose this life, this peace, this love, over that world 1,000 times over." He reached out, taking her hand in his. "I have you," he said, his voice filled with tenderness. "And that's all that matters." Bianca squeezed his hand, her heart overflowing with love. She knew he was right. They had made the right choice, the only choice they could have made. As they continued to build their new life, Bianca began to reflect on her own journey, on the transformation she had undergone. She had entered the Greco world as a frightened girl, a pawn in a dangerous game, a victim of circumstances. She had emerged from it a strong, resilient woman, a survivor, a warrior, a woman who had found her voice, her power, her love. One day, she was looking at herself in the mirror, studying her reflection. She saw the scar on her shoulder, the physical reminder of the violence she had endured. But she also saw something else, something more. She saw a woman who had faced her fears, who had overcome adversity, who had found love in the midst of darkness. The mirror was shattered, in a sense, reflecting the fragmented pieces of her past, the broken pieces of her former self. But it also offered a glimpse of her new self, a whole, healed, empowered woman who had emerged from the ashes of her old life. She was no longer Bianca Vitali, the daughter of a fallen don, the wife of a mafia capo. She was simply Bianca, a woman who had found her own identity, her own strength, her own purpose. She was free, and in that freedom, she found a beauty, a peace, a contentment she had never known before. The reflection was not just of her physical appearance, but of her soul, her spirit, her journey. Chapter 15. The Gathering Storm, the Unveiling of Secrets. Life in Tuscany settled into a peaceful rhythm. Bianca and Matteo embraced their newfound freedom, reveling in the simplicity and tranquility of their surroundings. They spent their days exploring the countryside, working in their garden, cooking together, and simply enjoying each other's company. They made friends with their neighbors, slowly integrating themselves into the local community, building a network of support and friendship. But the past, like a persistent shadow, was not entirely forgotten. There were moments of unease, fleeting anxieties, when the memory of their former life would intrude upon their peaceful existence. They knew that they were not entirely safe, that their enemies might still be searching for them, that the long arm of the mafia could reach them even in their secluded sanctuary. One day, a letter arrived, bearing no return address, the handwriting unfamiliar. Bianca opened it cautiously, her heart pounding with apprehension. The letter was brief, cryptic, and chilling. "You cannot escape your past. We know where you are. We are coming for you." Bianca felt a surge of fear, a cold dread that gripped her heart. She showed the letter to Matteo, his face hardening as he read it, his eyes narrowing with anger. "It's Rossi," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "He never forgets. He never forgives." "What do we do?" Bianca asked, her voice trembling. Matteo looked at her, his gaze intense.
"We fight," he said.
"We protect ourselves. We will not let him destroy what we have built." They spent the next few days preparing, fortifying their villa, making arrangements for their safety. They contacted their friends in the village, discreetly alerting them to the potential danger, asking for their help. They also reached out to Alessandro, Matteo's former lieutenant, who had taken over as capo of the Greco family. Alessandro, despite his initial resentment of Matteo's departure, had remained loyal, respecting his former boss's decision and honoring the agreement they had made. Alessandro promised to send help, to provide them with protection, but he also warned them that Rossi was a formidable enemy, that he had powerful allies, that he would stop at nothing to achieve his revenge. The waiting was the hardest part. The days were filled with a tense anticipation, the nights punctuated by nightmares and restless sleep. Bianca found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. She jumped at every unexpected sound, her nerves frayed, her anxiety growing. One evening, as they were sitting on the terrace, enjoying a quiet dinner, they heard a noise in the distance, the sound of approaching cars. Matteo stood up, his body tense, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun he had kept hidden, a relic from his past life. "It's them," he said, his voice grim. Bianca stood beside him, her hand gripping his, her heart pounding with fear. She looked out at the approaching cars, their headlights cutting through the darkness, their engines roaring like angry beasts. "We're ready," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. The cars stopped in front of the villa, and several men emerged, their faces hidden in the shadows, their weapons glinting in the moonlight. Rossi was among them, his large frame imposing, his cruel face twisted with hatred.
"Greco!"
Rossi shouted, his voice echoing through the night. "It's over. You cannot hide from me." Matteo stepped forward, his face a mask of cold determination. "Rossi," he said, his voice calm and steady. "You should have stayed away." "I came to finish what I started," Rossi said, his voice filled with venom. "To avenge my honor. To reclaim what is rightfully mine." "There is nothing here for you, Rossi," Matteo said. "Only death." The two men faced each other, the tension between them palpable, the air thick with the threat of violence. The standoff seemed to stretch for an eternity, the silence broken only by the sound of their breathing, the distant barking of a dog. Suddenly, a voice rang out from behind Rossi, a voice that was both familiar and unexpected. "That's enough, Salvatore." The men turned to see Don Angelo, Matteo's uncle, standing at the edge of the property, flanked by several of Alessandro's men, their weapons drawn and aimed at Rossi and his crew. Rossi stared at Angelo, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief.
"Anja?" he said.
What are you doing here?" "I am here to stop this madness," Angelo said, his voice firm and commanding. "To prevent more bloodshed. To uphold the honor of our families." He turned to Matteo, his gaze filled with a mixture of sadness and pride. "Matteo," he said, "you have chosen your path. I respect that. But you are still a Greco, and I will not allow you to be harmed." He turned back to Rossi, his eyes blazing with anger. "Salvatore," he said, "you have overstepped. You have broken the code. You have brought shame upon yourself and your family." Rossi tried to protest, to argue, but Angelo cut him off. "Silence,"
he roared.
"Your time is over. Your reign of terror ends tonight." Angelo gave a signal, and Alessandro's men disarmed Rossi and his crew, taking them into custody. Rossi struggled, cursing and threatening, but he was quickly subdued. As Rossi was being led away, he looked at Matteo, his eyes filled with hatred and defeat. "This is not over, Greco," he spat. "I will have my revenge." Matteo watched him go, his expression unreadable. He knew that Rossi was a dangerous enemy, that he would never give up, but for now, the threat was neutralized. Angelo approached Matteo, his face etched with weariness. It is over, Matteo, he said.
For now.
Thank you, Uncle, Matteo said, his voice filled with gratitude. Angelo nodded, his gaze shifting to Bianca. You are a brave woman, Bianca, he said. You have brought light into Matteo's life. You have shown him a different path. Bianca smiled, her heart filled with relief and gratitude. Thank you, Don Angelo, she said. Angelo turned to leave, his men following him. As he walked away, he paused, looking back at Matteo and Bianca. There is one more thing, he said, his voice hesitant. A secret I have kept for too long. A truth that must be revealed. The unveiling of secrets had begun, and the gathering storm, while temporarily calmed, had left behind a trail of revelations that would forever alter the course of their lives. Chapter 16. Blood and tears, loyalty and lies. Angelo's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Bianca and Matteo exchanged a look of apprehension, their hearts pounding with a mixture of curiosity and dread. What secret could Angelo be referring to? What truth had been hidden for so long? Angelo took a deep breath, his aged face etched with a mixture of sadness and resolve. It is about your father, Matteo, he said, his voice low and hesitant. About his death. Matteo stiffened, his body tense, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. What about it? He asked, his voice cold and guarded. He did not die of natural causes, Angelo said, his voice barely a whisper. He was murdered. Matteo stared at him, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Murdered? He repeated, his voice raw with anguish. By whom? Angelo hesitated, his gaze shifting towards the ground. By someone within our own family, he said. Bianca gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at Matteo, her eyes filled with concern. He looked like he had been struck by lightning, his body trembling, his face pale and drawn. Who? Matteo demanded, his voice rising in anger. Tell me. Who killed my father? Angelo looked up at him, his eyes filled with tears. It was Lorenzo Vitali, he said. Bianca felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Her father? Murder Matteo's father? It couldn't be true. It was impossible. No, she whispered, her voice shaking. That's a lie. My father would never, it's true. Bianca, Angelo said, his voice firm but gentle. I have proof. Documents. Witnesses. He explained that Lorenzo, years ago, had been involved in a power struggle with Matteo's father, a struggle that had escalated into a bitter feud. Lorenzo, fearing that he would lose control of his territory, had ordered a hit on Matteo's father, making it look like a heart attack. Angelo had discovered the truth years later, but he had kept it a secret, fearing that it would tear the family apart, that it would lead to more bloodshed and violence. He had hoped that the past could be buried, that the feud could be forgotten. But I can no longer keep the secret, Angelo said, his voice filled with remorse. Not after what you have both been through. Not after the sacrifices you have made. Matteo stood there, frozen, his mind reeling from the revelation. His father, the man he had idolized, the man he had tried so hard to emulate, had been murdered by Bianca's father, the man he had hated and sought revenge against. He looked at Bianca, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain, confusion, and betrayal. He saw the horror on her face, the tears streaming down her cheeks, the disbelief in her eyes. Did you know? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Bianca shook her head, her body trembling. No, she whispered. I swear, Matteo, I had no idea. I would never have. She couldn't finish the sentence, her voice choked with emotion. She felt like the world was crashing down around her, her past, her family, her love, all intertwined in a web of lies and deceit. Matteo turned away from her, his shoulders slumping, his body racked with grief and anger. He felt betrayed, not only by his uncle, but by Bianca, by her father, by the entire world. I need to be alone, he said, his voice hoarse. He walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the villa, leaving Bianca standing there, alone and heartbroken, her world shattered by the revelation. The blood of their fathers, The tears of their past had come back to haunt them, threatening to destroy the fragile love they had built, the new life they had created. The loyalty they had found in each other was now tested by the lies of their families, the sins of their ancestors. The truth had been revealed, but it had come at a terrible cost. Chapter 17. The Heart's Reckoning, the Soul's Awakening. The revelation of Lorenzo Vitali's involvement in the murder of Matteo's father cast a long, dark shadow over their lives. The fragile peace they had found in Tuscany was shattered, replaced by a chasm of mistrust, grief, and anger. Matteo retreated into himself, isolating himself from Bianca, unable to reconcile the image of her as the woman he loved with the daughter of his father's murderer. He spent his days walking the hills, his mind tormented by the past, his heart aching with a mixture of grief, betrayal, and a lingering, undeniable love for Bianca. Bianca, heartbroken and devastated, tried to reach out to him, to bridge the gap that had formed between them. She understood his pain, his anger, his sense of betrayal. She knew that she was innocent, that she had no knowledge of her father's crime, but she also knew that the blood of her father flowed in her veins, that she carried the burden of his sins. She wrote him letters, pouring out her heart, expressing her love, her remorse, her unwavering commitment to him. She left him small gifts, tokens of her affection, reminders of their shared moments of happiness. She cooked his favorite meals, leaving them on the table, hoping that he would join her, that they could talk, that they could find a way to heal. But Matteo remained distant, unreachable, lost in his own private hell. He avoided her, barely acknowledging her presence, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and accusation. Bianca refused to give up. She knew that their love was strong, that it had survived so much, that it could overcome this challenge as well. She believed in him, in his goodness, in his capacity for forgiveness. One evening, she found him sitting on the terrace, staring out at the darkening sky. He looked haggard, his face pale and drawn, his eyes red-rimmed with unshed tears. She approached him cautiously, her heart aching for him. She sat beside him, not touching him, respecting his need for space. "Matteo," she said, her voice soft and gentle.
"Please talk to me.
"Don't shut me out." He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I know you're hurting," Bianca continued. "I know you're angry. I understand. But I had nothing to do with it. I didn't know." He finally turned to her, his eyes filled with a raw, agonizing pain. "I know," he said, his voice hoarse. "I know you didn't." "Then why?" Bianca asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you pushing me away?" He looked away, his shoulders slumping.
"I don't know," he said.
I look at you, and I see him. I see my father. I see the betrayal." Bianca felt a tear roll down her cheek. "But I'm not him, Matteo," she said. "I'm me. I'm the woman who loves you, the woman who risked her life for you, the woman who has stood by you through everything." He looked at her, his gaze searching. He saw the pain in her eyes, the love, the unwavering commitment. He saw the truth, the reality of who she was, separate from her father, separate from the past. He reached out, his hand trembling, and gently touched her cheek. "I know," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I know you are." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, his body shaking with sobs. Bianca held him tight, her own tears flowing freely, her heart aching for his pain, for their shared suffering. They stayed there, together, in the darkness, clinging to each other, finding solace in their love, their shared grief, their unwavering commitment to each other. I don't know how to forgive," Matteo whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't know how to move on." "You don't have to do it alone," Bianca said, her voice firm. "We'll do it together. We'll find a way. We always do." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. "Can we?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Bianca said, her voice filled with conviction. "We can. We will." The heart's reckoning had begun, the painful process of confronting the past, of acknowledging the pain, of finding a way to forgive, to heal, to move forward. The soul's awakening was underway, a journey of self-discovery, of understanding, of acceptance. The love they shared, tested by the fires of betrayal and grief, was emerging stronger, more resilient, more profound. They were learning to forgive, not only each other's families, but themselves, for the burdens they carried, for the choices they had made. Chapter 18. A desperate gambit, a fateful choice. The process of healing was slow, arduous, but ultimately transformative. Bianca and Matteo began to rebuild their trust, brick by brick, conversation by conversation, shared moment by shared moment. They talked, they cried, they argued, they forgave. They sought counseling both individually and together, learning to process their trauma, to understand their emotions, to communicate their needs. They also began to delve deeper into the past, seeking to understand the circumstances that had led to Lorenzo Vitali's decision to murder Matteo's father. They uncovered a complex web of rivalries, betrayals, and power struggles, a world where violence was commonplace and loyalty was a fleeting commodity. They discovered that Lorenzo had been manipulated, misled by false information, by a conspiracy orchestrated by Rossi, who had been seeking to weaken both the Vitali and Greco families, to seize control of their territories. Rossi had played on Lorenzo's fears, his insecurities, his ambition, driving him to commit an act that would ultimately destroy his own life and cast a long shadow over the lives of his children. The revelation brought a new dimension to their understanding of the past, a sense of shared victimhood, a recognition that they had both been pawns in a larger, more sinister game. It did not excuse Lorenzo's actions, but it provided a context, a perspective that allowed Matteo to begin to release his anger, his hatred, his desire for revenge. One evening, as they were sitting on the terrace, watching the sunset, Matteo turned to Bianca. I think I'm ready, he said, his voice hesitant. To let go.
To forgive.
Bianca looked at him, her heart filled with love and admiration. I'm proud of you, Matteo, she said. It takes courage to forgive, to choose love over hate. He smiled, a faint, wistful smile.
It's not easy, he said.
But I know it's the right thing to do.
For us.
For our future. He reached out, taking her hand in his. I love you, Bianca, he said, his voice filled with tenderness. More than words can say. You have shown me a different way. A better way. And you, Matteo, Bianca said, her voice choked with emotion. You have shown me strength, resilience, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. They embraced, their hearts filled with a profound sense of peace, of closure, of renewed hope. The past was still there, a part of their story, but it no longer defined them. They had chosen to move forward, to build a future based on love, trust, and forgiveness. But their newfound peace was soon threatened. A message arrived from Alessandro, warning them that Rossi, despite being imprisoned, had managed to orchestrate a plan to escape. He was seeking revenge, not only on Matteo, but on Bianca, blaming her for his downfall, for the loss of his power and prestige. Matteo and Bianca knew that they were in danger, that Rossi would stop at nothing to achieve his revenge. They had a choice to make. They could run, hide, try to disappear again, or they could stand and fight, confront their enemy, end the cycle of violence once and for all. They discussed their options, weighing the risks, the potential consequences. They knew that running would only postpone the inevitable, that Rossi would eventually find them, that they would always be looking over their shoulder, living in fear. They decided to fight. They would not be victims. They would not allow Rossi to dictate their lives. They would use their combined strength, their intelligence, their love, to defeat him, to protect themselves, to secure their future. They devised a plan, a desperate gambit, a fateful choice. They would lure Rossi into a trap, using themselves as bait, exposing him to Alessandro and his men, ensuring his capture or, if necessary, his demise. It was a dangerous plan, a risky undertaking, but they were determined to see it through. They knew that their lives, their love, their future depended on it. They were ready to face their enemy, to confront the darkness, to embrace the light. The choice was made, The die was cast, and their fate, once again, hung in the balance. They were not merely reacting, they were acting, taking control of their destiny, choosing to confront their past and secure their future, together. Chapter 19. The lioness roars, the empire trembles. The plan was set in motion. Bianca and Matteo, working in close coordination with Alessandro, prepared for Rossi's arrival. They chose a remote location, an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of their village, a place where they could control the environment, limit the potential for collateral damage. They knew that Rossi would be expecting them to be at their villa, that he would be looking for an easy target, a quick and decisive victory. They used this expectation to their advantage, setting a trap that would exploit his arrogance, his overconfidence, his thirst for revenge. They spread rumors, false leads, hinting that they were planning to flee the country, that they were vulnerable, that they were afraid. They made sure that the information reached Rossi's network of informants, knowing that he would be monitoring their every move. On the designated night, they left their villa, making a show of their departure, driving in a direction opposite to the farmhouse, creating a diversion that would draw Rossi's attention away from their true destination. They arrived at the farmhouse, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The place was dark and desolate, the silence broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the nearby trees. They waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity, the tension thick and palpable. Bianca stayed close to Matteo, her hand gripping his, her presence a source of strength and comfort. Suddenly, they heard the sound of approaching cars, the roar of engines, the screech of tires. Rossi had arrived. Matteo moved swiftly, positioning himself near the entrance, his gun drawn and ready. Bianca stayed behind him, her eyes scanning the darkness, her senses heightened. Rossi and his men burst into the farmhouse, their weapons blazing, their faces contorted with rage and hatred. They were expecting to find Bianca and Matteo cowering, vulnerable, easy prey. Instead, they found themselves facing a trap. Matteo opened fire, his shots precise and deadly, taking down several of Rossi's men before they could even react. Alessandro and his men, who had been hidden in the surrounding fields, emerged from the darkness, flanking Rossi's forces, cutting off their escape. A fierce gun battle erupted, the farmhouse echoing with the sound of gunfire, the screams of men, the shattering of glass. Bianca stayed low, taking cover behind an overturned table, her heart pounding with fear, but also with a strange sense of exhilaration. She saw Rossi, his face a mask of fury, his eyes fixed on Matteo. He raised his gun, aiming it directly at Matteo's heart. Bianca reacted instinctively, without thinking. She grabbed a discarded weapon, a heavy iron poker that had been lying near the fireplace. She charged at Rossi, screaming at the top of her lungs, her voice filled with a primal rage, a fierce protectiveness. She swung the poker with all her might, striking Rossi on the side of the head. He staggered, his gun falling from his hand, his body collapsing to the floor. The fighting stopped. Rossi's men, seeing their leader defeated, surrendered, their weapons clattering to the ground. Matteo rushed to Bianca, his eyes filled with concern and admiration. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice trembling. Bianca nodded, her body shaking with adrenaline, her heart overflowing with a mixture of relief and triumph. I think so," she said, her voice hoarse. Alessandro and his men secured the area, taking Rossi and his crew into custody. Rossi was still alive, but he was seriously injured, his reign of terror finally over. As the dust settled, Bianca and Matteo stood together, amidst the wreckage of the farmhouse, the remnants of their past, the symbol of their victory. They had faced their enemy, they had confronted their fears, they had emerged victorious. The lioness had roared, her courage, her strength, her love, had saved the day. The empire, the world of violence and betrayal, had trembled before her, its power diminished, its grip loosened. They had won. Not just the battle, but the war. They had secured their freedom, their future, their love. They had proven that even in the darkest of worlds, light could prevail, that love could conquer all, that courage and determination could overcome even the most formidable of foes. The echoes of gunfire faded, replaced by the silence of victory, the promise of peace. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The aftermath of the confrontation at the farmhouse was a whirlwind of activity. Rossi was taken to a secure hospital, his injuries severe but not life-threatening. He would face trial, justice, and a long prison sentence, his reign of terror finally brought to an end. Alessandro and his men returned to Palermo, their mission accomplished, their loyalty to Matteo and Bianca reaffirmed. Bianca and Matteo were left to pick up the pieces, to assess the damage, to rebuild their lives once again. The farmhouse was a wreck, a testament to the violence that had erupted, a symbol of the past they were trying to escape. They returned to their villa, their sanctuary, their home. They spent the next few days cleaning up, repairing the damage, restoring order to their lives. They worked together, side by side, their shared efforts a symbol of their resilience, their determination to move forward, to create a future free from fear and violence.
As they worked, they talked.
They talked about the events of the past few weeks, about the dangers they had faced, about the choices they had made. They talked about Rossi, about his hatred, his obsession, his ultimate defeat. They also talked about their future, about their hopes, their dreams, their plans. They decided to stay in Tuscany, to continue building their new life, to embrace the peace and tranquility they had found. They would rebuild the farmhouse, transforming it from a place of violence and fear into a symbol of hope and renewal. One evening, as they were sitting on the terrace, watching the sunset, Matteo turned to Bianca. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice hesitant. Bianca looked at him, surprised. For what? She asked.
For doubting you, he said.
For letting the past cloud my judgment. For pushing you away. He reached out, taking her hand in his. I was blinded by my grief, by my anger, he said. I couldn't see the truth. I couldn't see you. Bianca squeezed his hand, her heart filled with love and understanding. It's all right, Matteo, she said. I understand. You were hurting. We both were. But I should have trusted you, he said. I should have known that you would never, that you could never. He couldn't finish the sentence, his voice choked with emotion. You do trust me, Bianca said, her voice firm. You do know. And that's all that matters. He looked at her, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. Thank you, he said, his voice barely a whisper. For everything. For your courage, your strength, your love. And thank you, Matteo, Bianca said, her voice filled with emotion. For believing in me. For giving me a chance. For choosing love over hate. They embraced, their hearts filled with a profound sense of peace, of closure, of renewed hope. The final confrontation had taken place, not between them and their enemies, but within their own hearts, within their own souls. They had confronted their past, their demons, their doubts, and they had emerged victorious. They had faced the ultimate test of loyalty, the challenge of forgiveness, the burden of their family's legacies, and they had chosen love. They had chosen trust. They had chosen each other. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the Tuscan hills. Bianca and Matteo stood together, their arms wrapped around each other, their hearts intertwined, their future stretching out before them, filled with promise, with hope, with the enduring power of love. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties had ended, and in its place a new beginning, a new chapter, a new life, had begun. The scars remained, a reminder of their past, but they were no longer a source of pain, but a symbol of their strength, their resilience, their enduring love. Epilogue. Years passed, the seasons turning in a gentle rhythm of life, love, and renewal. Bianca and Matteo rebuilt the farmhouse, transforming it into a beautiful, welcoming home, a testament to their resilience, their determination, their enduring love. They filled it with laughter, with joy, with the warmth of family and friends. They had children, 2 beautiful daughters, who grew up surrounded by love, by nature, by the simple pleasures of life in the Tuscan countryside. The girls knew nothing of their parents' past, of the violence and betrayal that had shaped their lives. They were raised in a world of peace, of security, of unwavering love. Bianca and Matteo never forgot their past, but they did not let it define them. They used their experiences, their knowledge, their connections to help others, to support their community, to advocate for peace and justice. They became pillars of their village, respected and admired for their kindness, their generosity, their unwavering commitment to making the world a better place. Matteo, once the feared and respected capo of the Greco family, became a gentle, loving father, a devoted husband, a respected member of his community. He found peace in the simple rhythms of life, in the beauty of nature, in the love of his family. He learned to forgive, to let go of the past, to embrace the present, to look forward to the future. Bianca, once the frightened girl, the pawn in a dangerous game, blossomed into a strong, confident, compassionate woman. She found her voice, her purpose, her strength. She became an advocate for victims of violence, a mentor for young women, a beacon of hope for those who had lost their way. They often sat on the terrace of their rebuilt farmhouse, watching the sunset, reminiscing about their journey, marveling at the transformation they had undergone. They remembered the darkness, the fear, the pain, but they also remembered the love, the courage, the resilience that had brought them through. One evening, as they were sitting together, hand in hand, watching their daughters play in the garden, Bianca turned to Matteo. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "We made it." Matteo smiled, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. "Yes, Cara," he said.
"We did.
We created our own destiny." He leaned over and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of a lifetime of love, of shared experiences, of unwavering commitment. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the Tuscan hills. Bianca and Matteo, surrounded by the love of their family, the beauty of their surroundings, the peace of their hearts, knew that they had found their happily ever after, not in a fairy tale, but in the reality of their own making, in the strength of their love, in the courage of their choices, in the enduring power of the human spirit. The past was a memory, the future a promise, and the present a gift, a testament to the transformative power of love, forgiveness, and the unwavering pursuit of a life lived on their own terms. They had weathered every storm, faced every challenge, and emerged, together, stronger, wiser, and more deeply in love than ever before. Their story was a testament to the enduring human capacity for hope, healing, and the creation of a beautiful life, even from the ashes of a broken past. The end.